It was the kind of night that seeped into your skin and left a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Inside the walls of Blackgate Penitentiary, a facility notorious for housing the most violent offenders, the air was thick with an unshakable sense of dread. The prison, built in the late 1800s, had a dark history of riots, mysterious deaths, and disappearances that no investigation could explain. New inmates were often warned by veterans to steer clear of cell block E. Officially, it was closed for renovations, but everyone knew that was a lie. Unofficially, Block E was known as the Tomb. Rumors swirled about it being haunted by prisoners who had died gruesome deaths. Guards avoided it, and even the most hardened criminals shuddered at the thought of being assigned to that wing. One inmate, Daniel Grayson, arrived at Blackgate under grim circumstances. Convicted of armed robbery and manslaughter, he was no stranger to danger. Daniel had heard the tales about the tomb, but dismissed them as the kind of stories inmates told to pass the time. That was until the night he was transferred to cell block E after a brawl in the mess hall. The wing was eerily silent. The dim, flickering lights cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. The cell doors were rusted and the walls bore strange scratches, as if someone or something had clawed at them in desperation. Daniel's unease deepened when he realized his cell door didn't lock properly. It creaked open slightly every few minutes, as if inviting something unseen to slip inside. The first night, Daniel was awoken by whispers. Faint and indecipherable at first, they grew louder until they seemed to come from every corner of his cell. He shouted into the darkness, demanding to know who was there, but the whispers stopped as suddenly as they had started. He convinced himself it was just his imagination, a product of stress and fatigue. By the third night, the whispers were accompanied by the sound of footsteps pacing the corridor outside his cell. Daniel peered out but saw no one. The footsteps didn't follow any pattern. They started and stopped at random, sometimes sounding like they were right outside his door, other times fading into the distance. The other inmates in Block E were unusually quiet, and Daniel began to wonder if he was the only one hearing these noises. It wasn't until the fifth night that Daniel saw the figure. It was just past midnight when he awoke to find a man standing in the corner of his cell. The figure was gaunt, his skin pale and almost translucent. His eyes were black voids, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Daniel froze, paralyzed with fear, as the figure whispered, "You don't belong here." The next morning, Daniel tried to tell the guards what he had seen, but they dismissed him, saying he was trying to manipulate his way out of solitary confinement. Desperate, Daniel began to question the other inmates about the figure, but they avoided his questions, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. One older prisoner finally broke his silence, warning Daniel to never acknowledge the figure if it appeared again. "Once it knows you see it," he whispered, "it won't leave you alone." That night, Daniel lay awake, too afraid to sleep. Around 2 a.m., the whispers started again, louder and more insistent this time. The temperature in the cell plummeted, and Daniel could see his breath in the air. The cell door creaked open, and the figure stepped inside, its grin wider than before. "You shouldn't have stayed," it hissed, its voice a chilling mix of anger and glee. Daniel screamed, but no one came. The lights flickered, plunging the cell into complete darkness. When they came back on, the figure was gone, but Daniel was no longer alone. His cellmate, who had been asleep moments earlier, was now slumped against the wall, his throat slit from ear to ear. Blood pooled on the floor, forming strange, intricate patterns that seemed to pulse and writhe like living organisms. The guards found Daniel in the morning, curled up in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering about shadows and whispers. The cellmate's death was ruled a suicide, though the circumstances baffled even the most seasoned investigators. Daniel was transferred to a psychiatric facility where he refused to speak of what he had experienced in Block E. Years later, Blackgate Penitentiary was shut down, its dark history finally catching up with it. Urban explorers who dared to enter the abandoned facility reported hearing whispers, seeing shadowy figures, and finding fresh bloodstains in the cells of Block E. None of them stayed long enough to discover what or who was behind the haunting. Daniel, now an old man, still wakes up screaming, the memory of the figure burned into his mind. He knows the truth that no one else will admit. Some prisons are more than just buildings. They're alive, and they never let their victims go. The winter storm came out of nowhere, battering the countryside with howling winds and blinding snow. Among the frozen landscape stood Coldridge Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison for the worst of society's offenders. Isolated and foreboding, the prison was built in the 1930s on the ruins of a burned-down asylum, a detail few staff members liked to discuss. That night, the power failed just after dinner. Emergency generators kicked in, but their dim light barely illuminated the grim corridors. Guards scrambled to restore order as inmates shouted and banged on their cell doors, their voices echoing through the cavernous halls. In the chaos, an alarm went off, signaling a breach in one of the solitary confinement wings. Wing C housed the most dangerous prisoners, and among them was the infamous Malcolm Rourke. Convicted of murdering 23 people in a spree of ritualistic killings, Rourke claimed he was merely a servant to something greater. During his trial, he spoke of a shadowy entity that demanded sacrifices. His chilling smile and empty eyes were the stuff of nightmares. When guards reached Rourke's cell, they found the door wide open. Inside was a scene of horror. The walls were covered in crude symbols scrawled in blood. The air was icy, and a smell of decay lingered. Rourke was gone. A prison-wide lockdown was issued, but the storm had knocked out communications. The guards, armed and on edge, swept through the facility. One by one, they found inmates dead in their cells, their bodies contorted as if they had been in agony. The same symbols from Rourke's cell were etched into the walls, always written in blood. The guards' radios crackled with static, occasionally punctuated by whispers. One guard, Jenkins, swore he heard his own name spoken faintly through the noise. His colleagues dismissed it as nerves. But as they pressed deeper into the prison, the whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of overlapping voices, each one dripping with malice. In the main corridor, they found Rourke standing in the flickering light, his prison uniform soaked in blood. He was chanting in a language no one recognized, his voice guttural and unnatural. The guards ordered him to the ground, but he only smiled, raising his arms as if in offering. Then the lights went out completely. In the pitch darkness, the whispers turned to screams. Gunshots echoed, but they did nothing to dispel the unseen terror. Flashlights flickered to life, revealing fleeting glimpses of something inhuman moving in the shadows. Long, distorted limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to burn with hatred. By the time the backup generators kicked in, only 2 guards remained. They were found huddled in a supply closet, incoherent and trembling. Both were institutionalized, unable to describe what they had seen. Rourke was never found. The official report claimed he perished in the chaos, but rumors persisted. Some said he had been consumed by the entity he worshipped. Others believed he had become something else entirely, a vessel for whatever horror lurked in the dark corners of Coldridge. Years later, when the prison was demolished, construction workers unearthed a hidden basement beneath Wing C. Inside were crude altars, skeletal remains, and more of those blood-soaked symbols. The site was abandoned, declared unsafe for redevelopment. To this day, locals avoid the area. On stormy nights, some claim to see faint lights flickering where the prison once stood. Others say they hear whispers carried on the wind, beckoning anyone foolish enough to come closer. The small town of Grimsby, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, held an unsettling secret: its abandoned juvenile detention center. Built in the 1950s and closed after a series of scandals in the 1980s, the facility was a hulking, decaying structure covered in graffiti and strangled by creeping vines. Locals called it the Hollow and warned visitors to stay away. They said the place was cursed. No one could explain why so many boys disappeared from the facility during its operation. Officially, they were runaways. Unofficially, the whispers told a darker tale. The head warden, Elias Grisham, had used the boys for experiments. Rumors of occult practices and ritual sacrifices swirled, but nothing was ever proven. Grisham disappeared before he could be arrested, leaving the Hollow to rot. Years later, 4 thrill-seeking teenagers, Mark, Lisa, Joey, and Kara, decided to explore the Hollow on Halloween night. Armed with flashlights and a video camera, they crept through a hole in the chain-link fence, their laughter masking their nervousness. Inside, the air was heavy and still, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The walls were covered in peeling paint, revealing strange carvings beneath, jagged symbols, and crude faces with hollow eyes. The teens joked to keep their fear at bay, but something about the place felt wrong. They ventured deeper into the detention center, finding rusted beds, shattered glass, and a disturbing number of small dusty shoes scattered across the floors. Lisa swore she heard footsteps behind them, but when they stopped to listen, all they heard was silence. In the basement, they discovered a locked steel door. Joey, the bravest of the group, managed to break it open with a crowbar. The room beyond was pitch black and reeked of mildew and rot. Mark's flashlight beam revealed what looked like an old operating table surrounded by shelves lined with dusty jars. The jars held unrecognizable objects, some organic, others mechanical, all of them grotesque. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Kara screamed and the flashlight flickered wildly. The air grew icy and a low, guttural growl echoed through the room. Mark shone his flashlight toward the sound, and they saw it, a figure hunched in the corner, its back turned. It looked human at first, but its limbs were unnaturally long and its skin was mottled in gray. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, turning its head to reveal a face that wasn't a face at all. Its features were warped, like melted wax, with hollow black eyes and a wide, lipless mouth that stretched far too wide. The teens bolted, but the creature followed, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it skittered after them. The hallways seemed to twist and stretch, leading them in circles. The graffiti on the walls bled fresh, red streaks, and the whispers began, faint at first, then deafening, overlapping voices crying out in pain and rage. They reached the main door only to find it chained shut. The creature closed in, its bony fingers clicking against the floor. In a desperate move, Mark smashed a window, and they scrambled through, tearing their clothes on the jagged glass. They didn't stop running until they were miles away, collapsing on the side of the road. When they finally turned to look back, the hollow was shrouded in darkness, but they swore they saw a figure standing in the broken window, watching them. Mark uploaded the footage from their camera the next day, but it was mostly static. The few clear frames showed the creature, its hollow eyes staring directly into the lens, its mouth open in a silent scream. The teens never spoke of the hollow again. Over time, they drifted apart, each haunted by nightmares of twisted hallways and grotesque figures. Years later, Mark vanished while on a hiking trip. Lisa found claw marks on her bedroom walls one morning. Joey was found dead in his apartment, his face frozen in a mask of terror. Only Kara survived, moving far away and changing her name, though she always felt as though something was watching her. The hollow still stands, a decaying monument to the horrors it hides. Locals say they hear faint cries from the building at night, and some claim to see shadowy figures moving behind the boarded-up windows. No one dares to enter, but everyone agrees. Whatever haunts the hollow isn't finished. The Greywood Asylum had been abandoned for decades, its broken windows and collapsing roof a scar on the outskirts of town. Built in the early 1900s, it once housed hundreds of patients deemed too dangerous for society. Whispers about cruel experiments, botched lobotomies, and unmarked graves surrounded its dark history. When the asylum was abruptly closed in the 1970s, the records were sealed, and no one dared to speak of what had transpired within its walls. Despite its reputation, thrill seekers occasionally braved the asylum's eerie halls. None stayed long. Most returned pale and shaken, mumbling about voices in the dark or the feeling of unseen eyes watching them. One night, a group of ghost hunters decided to document the asylum's haunted history. Armed with cameras, EMF detectors, and digital recorders, they entered through the crumbling front doors, stepping into the oppressive silence of the asylum. The team, Sam, the skeptical leader, Rachel, the sensitive with a knack for detecting spirits, Mike, the tech expert, and Jess, the camera operator, began their exploration in the main lobby. The air was thick with decay and mildew, and their footsteps echoed ominously. Rachel shivered as they passed the peeling murals on the walls, remnants of a time when the asylum had tried to present itself as a place of healing. "It feels heavy here," she whispered, "like something is watching us." Sam rolled his eyes. "Let's stick to facts, okay? Feelings don't count as evidence." They set up their equipment in the old recreation room. The EMF detector spiked almost immediately, and the temperature dropped, their breath visible in the air. Jess began filming as Rachel conducted a spirit box session. "Is anyone here with us?" Rachel asked. The static-filled device crackled to life. Amid the noise, a voice rasped, "Get out!" Sam leaned in, his skepticism faltering. "Why do you want us to leave?" There was a long pause, then the voice returned, louder and more menacing. "This is my home." The team exchanged uneasy glances, but Sam insisted they continue. They moved to the second floor, where the most violent patients had been kept. The hallways were lined with rusted wheelchairs and broken gurneys. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of their flashlight beams, but every time they turned to look, there was nothing there. In room 237, the door slammed shut behind them. Mike rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature plummeted, and Rachel began to shake violently. "It's here," she gasped. "It's in the room with us." Jess turned the camera toward Rachel, but the lens fogged over. A guttural growl filled the air, and the lights on their equipment flickered wildly. The door finally gave way, and the team stumbled out into the hallway. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a ghost, it's something worse." Sam reluctantly agreed, but as they descended the stairs, they heard a child's laughter echoing behind them. They stopped, frozen. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, until it became a high-pitched scream. The team bolted for the exit, but the asylum seemed to shift around them. Hallways stretched impossibly long, doors led to nowhere, and staircases looped back on themselves. Mike's camera captured glimpses of movement, figures darting just out of sight, their faces twisted in agony. They finally reached the front doors, only to find them chained shut from the outside. Desperate, they smashed a window and crawled out, cutting themselves on the broken glass. As they ran to their car, they saw lights flickering in the upper windows of the asylum, even though the building had no power. Back at home, Mike reviewed the footage. In several frames, a tall, shadowy figure loomed behind the group, its eyes glowing faintly. When he slowed the video, he realized the figure wasn't just following them, it was reaching for them. Rachel quit ghost hunting and moved across the country, claiming she still felt its presence. Jess never released the footage, saying some things were better left unseen. Sam became a recluse, spending his days researching demonology, convinced they had encountered something beyond human comprehension. Mike disappeared a year later, his apartment left untouched except for one word scratched into the walls: home. The asylum still stands, its windows dark and its halls silent. But those who pass by at night say they see flickering lights inside and hear faint laughter carried on the wind. Whatever haunts Greywood Asylum is still waiting, eager for its next visitors. There's a stretch of highway in rural Wyoming known as Route 41, but locals call it the Devil's Mile. The road is isolated, winding through miles of barren land and dense, eerie woods. Its reputation for unexplained disappearances has made it a ghost story whispered around campfires, but few dare to test its truth. One rainy night, Tom and Rachel, a young couple on a cross-country road trip, found themselves on Route 41. They had gotten lost after taking a wrong turn, and their GPS had led them down the desolate road. The storm grew heavier, and the headlights barely cut through the sheets of rain. "What is this place?" Rachel muttered, staring out at the endless darkness. Tom shrugged. "Just a shortcut. We'll be back on the main road soon." The first sign of trouble came when they passed an old gas station, its flickering neon sign spelling "open," even though the windows were dark. Rachel suggested stopping to ask for directions, but Tom shook his head. Something about the place felt off. As they drove deeper into the woods, the road began to feel wrong. It twisted unnaturally, and Tom swore they had passed the same rusted-out car twice. The rain pounded harder, and the radio crackled with static before shutting off entirely. "Are we going in circles?" Rachel asked, her voice tinged with panic. Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. The trees pressed closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull it off the road. Then the engine sputtered and died, leaving them stranded in the suffocating silence. Tom tried the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. Rachel grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. That's when they saw it, a figure standing in the road just ahead. At first, it looked like a man, tall and thin, wearing a black coat. But as the lightning flashed, they realized its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its neck too thin, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood perfectly still, as though waiting for them to move. "Don't get out," Rachel whispered, clutching Tom's arm. "Whatever you do, don't get out." Tom nodded, locking the doors. The figure took a step forward, then another. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost taunting. They couldn't see its face, but they felt its gaze, heavy and oppressive, as if it were peeling away their sanity layer by layer. Suddenly, there was a loud thud on the roof of the car. Rachel screamed, and Tom frantically turned the key, praying the engine would roar to life. The figure was closer now, its head tilting farther, its arms reaching for the car. Then, from the woods, more figures emerged. They moved in unison, their limbs bending unnaturally, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. There were too many to count, surrounding the car in a silent, menacing circle. Finally, the engine roared to life. Tom floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The figures didn't move to block them, but seemed to vanish into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. They drove in silence, hearts pounding until the woods thinned and the rain eased. Hours later, they reached a small diner at the edge of the next town. The staff stared at them as they stumbled in, soaked and pale. "You came from Route 41? An older man behind the counter asked, his face grim. Tom nodded, too shaken to speak. The man sighed, his gaze darkening. "Not many make it out once they've seen them." "Seen what?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "The Watchers," the man said. "Spirits, demons, whatever you want to call them. They don't like trespassers." When they returned to their car, they found deep, claw-like scratches etched into the roof, as if something had tried to rip it open. The scratches were accompanied by a single word carved into the hood. "Stay." Tom and Rachel abandoned their road trip and never spoke of Route 41 again. But at night, Rachel swore she could still hear the tapping of rain on the roof and feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her from the shadows. Route 41 remains a mystery. Some say it's cursed, others that it's a gateway to another realm. But everyone agrees, once the Watchers mark you, they never truly let you go. The small town of Black Hollow was proud of its clock tower, a towering iron and stone structure built in the late 1800s. Its bells rang every hour, echoing through the valley, a comforting rhythm for the townsfolk. But as with many old places, the clock tower had a dark legend attached to it. The story went that the tower's original builder, Henry Blackwell, went mad before the tower was completed. He claimed the clock's mechanism spoke to him, whispering secrets about time, death, and something beyond comprehension. One night, Blackwell climbed to the top of the tower and threw himself off, his body landing in the town square. Since then, locals believed the clock tower was cursed. They said if you climbed to the top at midnight, you'd hear the whispers too, and you'd never be the same. No one in Black Hollow tested the legend, at least not until a group of teenagers, bored and full of bravado, decided to break into the clock tower on Halloween night. Jake, the ringleader, laughed off the warnings from the old caretaker, Mr. Palmer, who had spotted them sneaking around the locked gate. "Suit yourselves," Palmer said, his voice grave, "but don't blame me if you hear the whispers." The group, Jake, Emma, Riley, and Beth, forced the rusted door open and stepped inside. The air was cold, and the smell of oil and mildew filled the space. Their flashlights barely pierced the darkness as they climbed the narrow, spiraling staircase. "Creepy," Emma muttered, running her hand along the crumbling stone wall. "Feels like this place hasn't been touched in decades. Except for the clock," Riley pointed out, nodding toward the steady ticking that echoed through the tower. "It's still working." They reached the top just before midnight. The clock's massive gears and pendulums loomed around them, casting long shadows. Through the narrow windows, they could see the town below, the lights twinkling faintly in the distance. Jake grinned, pulling out his phone to record. "All right, time to prove this whole whisper thing is just a dumb story." As the clock struck 12, the bells rang out, deafening and disorienting. The group covered their ears, wincing at the sound. Then, as the final chime faded, the silence was filled with something else, a low, murmuring voice. "Did you hear that?" Beth whispered, her face pale. "No way," Jake said, but his bravado was faltering. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't in English or any language they recognized. It sounded ancient, guttural, and wrong, like a language that shouldn't exist. Emma pointed toward the clock's central mechanism. It's coming from there. The group gathered around the massive gears, their flashlights illuminating an old iron hatch set into the floor. It was bolted shut, but faint whispers seeped from the cracks like air escaping from a tomb. "Don't open it," Riley said, his voice trembling. But Jake, determined to prove he wasn't afraid, ignored him. He pried the hatch open with a crowbar they'd brought, revealing a dark, yawning hole. The whispers erupted, louder now, filled with rage and hunger. A cold wind rushed out of the hatch, extinguishing their flashlights. In the pitch black, they felt something move, something large, something with too many limbs. Emma screamed as a hand, bony and impossibly long, reached out of the hole, grabbing her ankle. The group scattered, blinded and panicked. Jake fumbled with his phone, its dim light barely illuminating the creature that was climbing out of the hatch. Its face was a twisted mockery of humanity, its eyes black pits, its mouth filled with rows of jagged teeth. They ran down the stairs, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. The tower seemed to twist and shift, the stairs spiraling endlessly. By the time they reached the bottom, only Jake, Emma, and Riley remained. Beth was gone. They burst into the town square, screaming for help, but no one came. When they looked back, the clock tower was dark, silent, and still. No sign of the creature, no sign of Beth. The next morning, the townsfolk found the three huddled outside the tower, their faces pale and eyes hollow. When asked what happened, they could only mumble about whispers and darkness. Beth's body was never found. The clock tower still stands, its bells ringing faithfully every hour. But locals say the whispering has grown louder over the years, and some nights they see shadows moving in the windows. No one climbs the tower anymore. The gate is locked, but occasionally the hatch at the top opens on its own, spilling a cold wind into the town below. The whispers are waiting. The town of Crescent Falls had always been quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing unusual ever happened. But deep in the woods, hidden by a canopy of dense trees, stood the abandoned Fairview Orphanage. Locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted. They spoke of shadows that moved without light and children's laughter that echoed in the empty halls. The orphanage had closed decades ago, after a fire killed most of the children and staff. Some said it wasn't an accident, that the headmistress, Miss Abigail Granger, had started the fire herself. Rumors swirled about her obsession with the occult and her strange rituals late at night, but nothing was ever proven. Miss Granger disappeared the night of the fire. Her body never recovered. One autumn evening, 4 friends, Trevor, Zoe, and Lucas, decided to explore the orphanage. Halloween was just around the corner, and they thought it would make for a good story. Armed with flashlights and their phones, they pushed open the rusted gates and stepped into the overgrown courtyard. The orphanage loomed before them, its windows shattered and its doors sagging on their hinges. As they entered, the air grew cold, and the faint smell of burned wood lingered. Dust motes swirled in their flashlight beams, and the sound of their footsteps echoed eerily. "This place is a dump," Trevor said, kicking a charred piece of furniture. "What's so scary about it?" "It's not the building," Mia replied. "It's what's supposed to still be here." "Like ghosts?" Zoe scoffed. "Please." They moved deeper into the orphanage, passing rooms filled with broken toys and singed bedding. On one wall, faint scratches spelled out words, "She is watching." "Creepy," Lucas muttered, snapping a photo with his phone. In the dining hall, the long tables were still set with dusty plates and silverware, as if the children had been called away in the middle of a meal. Zoe's flashlight flickered, and she smacked it against her palm. When it came back on, she gasped. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "See what?" Trevor asked. There was a kid standing by the door. The group turned, but the doorway was empty. Nervous laughter bubbled up as they tried to brush it off, but the tension was palpable. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, as the air grew heavier, the faint sound of laughter drifted toward them, high-pitched and playful. They froze, their breaths hitching. The laughter turned into soft whispers, unintelligible but undeniably close. "Maybe we should go," Mia said, her voice barely audible. "No way," Trevor said, though his bravado was fading. "We're almost to the attic. That's where they say Miss Granger did her, rituals." The attic door was padlocked, but Trevor broke it open with a crowbar. Inside, the room was filled with strange symbols drawn on the walls and floor. A blackened wooden chair sat in the center, surrounded by melted candles. "What the hell is this?" Lucas muttered, stepping closer. As Mia inspected the symbols, the room grew unbearably cold. Suddenly, the door slammed shut and their flashlights went out. Panicked, they fumbled with their phones, but none of the lights would turn on. Then came the sound of footsteps, small, barefoot, and impossibly many. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. "She's coming," a child's voice said, clear as day. The group screamed as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman in a tattered dress, her face obscured by tangled black hair. Her head tilted unnaturally, and her movements were jerky, as if she were a puppet on strings. In her hand, she held a charred doll, its eyes glowing faintly. "You shouldn't be here," the woman rasped, her voice layered with others, as if the children were speaking through her. The group bolted, tripping over debris as they fled the attic. The orphanage seemed to come alive, the walls groaning and the floor shifting beneath them. Laughter and screams echoed from every direction. When they finally burst outside, they didn't stop running until they reached the car. As they sped away, Mia glanced back and saw the woman standing in the doorway, surrounded by shadowy figures. The children waved at her, their eyes glowing in the darkness. None of them spoke about what happened, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they had been marked. At night, they heard faint whispers in their homes and saw shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. A week later, Trevor disappeared, his phone found in the woods near the orphanage. On its screen was a photo of the attic with a single message written in ash. "She is waiting." Fairview Orphanage still stands, though the police have cordoned it off after countless reports of missing persons. Locals say the laughter can still be heard at night, and those who are foolish enough to enter rarely come out. Miss Granger and her children are always looking for new playmates. There's an old bridge on the outskirts of Harrow's Creek that locals call Widow's Crossing. At first glance, it's an unremarkable structure, wooden planks, weathered railings, and a slow-moving creek beneath it. But the stories tied to the bridge are anything but ordinary. The legend goes that in the 1800s, a woman named Eleanor Morgan was left waiting for her husband to return from war. When he never came back, Eleanor, consumed by grief, hung herself from the bridge. The townsfolk buried her in an unmarked grave nearby, hoping to silence the whispers of her spirit. But silence never came. For decades, people crossing the bridge at night have reported strange phenomena. The sound of footsteps pacing above the creek, faint sobbing in the air, and a chilling voice whispering, "Where is he?" The dare to cross Widow's Crossing at midnight was a rite of passage for teenagers in Harrow's Creek. Few actually followed through, but those who did came back changed, silent, pale, and unwilling to talk about what they had seen. One autumn night, 4 friends, Ben, Sarah, Mia, and Eric, decided they'd finally confront the legend. Armed with flashlights, a Ouija board, and a bottle of whiskey for courage, they set out just before midnight. The woods surrounding the bridge were eerily quiet, the usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves replaced by an oppressive stillness. When they reached the bridge, Sarah laughed nervously. "This is it? I thought it'd be scarier," Ben grinned, trying to mask his unease. "It's just an old bridge. Let's set up and prove this whole thing is fake." They laid the Ouija board in the center of the bridge and placed their fingers on the planchette. The flashlight beams barely pierced the darkness, and the creek below whispered softly as if alive. "Is anyone here with us?" Mia asked, her voice steady despite the tension. At first, nothing happened. The planchette didn't move, and the woods remained silent. Then a gust of wind swept over the bridge, carrying with it a faint sobbing sound. The planchette jerked violently, moving to "Yes!" "Okay, who's messing with it?" Eric said, looking around at the others. "No one," Mia whispered, her eyes wide. "Ask something else." "Eleanor, are you here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The planchette moved slowly, deliberately, spelling out, "Wherehe." A low groan echoed from beneath the bridge, and the sobbing grew louder. Ben shone his flashlight over the edge, but the beam revealed nothing but the black water below. "Let's go," Mia said, her voice cracking. "We've proven it. Let's just go." Before anyone could move, the sobbing turned into a scream, a raw, heart-wrenching wail that seemed to come from all around them. The temperature plummeted, and the boards beneath their feet creaked ominously. Then they saw her. A woman in a tattered black dress stood at the far end of the bridge. Her face was hidden by a veil, but her posture was unnatural. her head tilted at an impossible angle, as though her neck had been broken. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice sharp and filled with despair. None of them could speak. The woman took a step forward, and the bridge groaned as if it couldn't bear her weight. Ben stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight, which rolled to the edge of the bridge. The woman's veil shifted slightly, revealing empty sockets where her eyes should have been. Eric screamed and bolted, running back into the woods. The others followed, too terrified to look back. When they finally reached the edge of town, they found Eric sitting on the ground, shaking violently. She followed me," he whispered. "I felt her breath on my neck." The group vowed never to speak of what happened that night, but none of them were the same afterward. Sarah moved away, refusing to even visit Harrow's Creek. Mia stopped sleeping, haunted by dreams of the veiled woman. Eric disappeared 6 months later, his car found abandoned near Widow's Crossing. Ben, desperate for closure, returned to the bridge one last time. He left a bouquet of flowers and whispered an apology into the dark. The townsfolk found his body the next morning, hanging from the bridge, his face twisted in terror. The legend of Widow's Crossing grew darker after that. Now, the locals warn travelers not to stop near the bridge after sunset. They say Eleanor is still searching for her lost husband, and if you cross her path, she'll make you stay with her, forever. The remote mountain village of Halloridge had one peculiar rule: never ring the church bell after sundown. The townsfolk avoided speaking of the reason, but their eyes always darted nervously to the towering stone church at the village's center whenever the subject arose. It was old, its walls covered in creeping ivy, and its bell tower stretched ominously into the sky. The story went that 100 years ago, a priest named Father Malachi had gone mad. Obsessed with the idea of purging sin, he would drag villagers to the church at night, forcing them to confess under the threat of unspeakable punishments. The bell rang each time he took another victim, tolling endlessly until his reign of terror ended in fire. When the villagers stormed the church to stop him, they found only his robes and his burned Bible. His body was never recovered, but the ringing stopped, until one night it didn't. It was said that those who rang the bell after dark summoned him, and he would drag them into the shadows, their screams fading with the final toll of the bell. On a cold October evening, a group of college friends, Daniel, Claire, Jess, and Liam, decided to visit Halloridge. They'd heard the stories and thought it would make for a fun, spooky adventure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group stood outside the church, its Gothic structure looming over them. "This is it," Liam said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like every other old church." "You're missing the point," Jess said, clutching her camera. "We're here to see if the bell really rings. Maybe catch some ghost footage." "Ghosts," Daniel scoffed, rolling his eyes. "It's just an old legend. Watch, I'll prove it." Before anyone could stop him, Daniel pushed open the heavy wooden doors. They creaked loudly, revealing a dark, cold interior. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by their flashlights. The group hesitated, but Daniel waved them forward. "Come on," he said. "Let's find the stairs to the bell tower." Reluctantly, they followed. The staircase spiraled upward, narrow and claustrophobic. With every step, the air grew colder and an unsettling pressure weighed on them. "This place is giving me the creeps," Claire whispered. "Can we just go back?" "No way," Daniel said, grinning. "We're already here." They reached the top, the bell towering above them, massive and ancient, its surface etched with strange, faded symbols. Daniel stepped forward, grabbing the frayed rope attached to it. "Don't," Claire said sharply. "You don't know what." Before she could finish, Daniel yanked the rope. The bell let out a deep, resonant bong that reverberated through the night. The sound was deafening, shaking the tower. "See? Nothing's happening," Daniel said, but his voice wavered. Then came the second toll. Bong! Daniel froze. His hand was no longer on the rope. The bell swung on its own, groaning as it moved. The third toll followed, and with it came a faint whisper, like a breeze slipping through the cracks of the tower. It wasn't the wind, though. It was words. "Who dares summon me?" The group backed away as the whispers grew louder, merging into a guttural chant. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the dim light. "Let's get out of here!" Jess screamed. Bolting for the stairs, the others followed, but the staircase seemed impossibly long, stretching farther with every step they took. The bell tolled again, louder and more distorted, and the chanting turned into a cacophony of voices. Out of the corner of his eye, Liam saw movement. a shadow climbing the walls of the tower, moving faster than humanly possible. It was tall, twisted, and its face was obscured, but its hollow eyes burned with hatred. They burst out of the church, slamming the doors behind them. The bell continued to toll, echoing through the village. The streets were empty, the houses dark, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the relentless sound of the bell. As they ran, the whispers followed them. "Sinners, confess." Claire tripped and fell, screaming as shadowy hands reached for her from the ground. Liam pulled her to her feet, and they ran until they were out of breath. When they finally stopped, the bell fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. Then they noticed Daniel wasn't with them. "Where's Daniel?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. They retraced their steps to the church, but Daniel was gone. The bell tower was silent and still, and the heavy wooden doors refused to budge. The next morning, the villagers found Daniel's body slumped at the base of the bell. His face was twisted in terror, his hands blackened as if burned, and his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. The bell was cracked, and etched into its surface were fresh symbols, ones that hadn't been there the night before. The villagers buried Daniel in the town cemetery, adding his name to the list of those lost to the bell. The church remains locked, its tower shrouded in shadow. But every so often, on a cold, quiet night, the bell rings again, tolling for those who dare to disturb Father Malachi's eternal watch. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains lies a forgotten road known as the Devil's Vein. It's a winding, narrow stretch of asphalt that cuts through dense, ancient woods. Locals warn against traveling it after sunset, not because of its treacherous turns, but because of what they call the Pale Rider. The legend says that a hitchhiker, pale as moonlight and dressed in tattered clothes, appears by the roadside at night. If you stop to offer a ride, he'll climb into your back seat silently, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. He doesn't speak, but as you drive, you'll notice the world outside the car growing darker, colder, and quieter. If you look at him too long, his face will slowly turn toward you, revealing hollow eyes and a jagged, inhuman smile. Those who've seen it don't live long enough to tell the tale. It was late October when Marcus and his girlfriend Leah decided to take a scenic drive through the mountains. They'd heard whispers about the Devil's Vein, but dismissed it as a campfire story. After dinner in a nearby town, Marcus suggested they take the route back to their cabin for an adventure. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Leah asked, clutching her jacket as the car crept onto the dimly lit road. "It's just a shortcut," Marcus said with a grin. "Don't let some old ghost story freak you out." The trees pressed in on both sides of the road, their bare branches forming claw-like silhouettes against the starless sky. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the occasional hoot of an owl. After about 20 minutes, the headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. A man, thin, almost skeletal, wearing a long coat and a hat that obscured his face. He didn't move, didn't stick out a thumb, just stood there, staring into the car's path. "Did you see that?" Leah whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Yeah, but we're not stopping." As they passed the man, Leah turned to look out the rear window. Her breath caught in her throat. "He's gone," she said. "What do you mean gone?" Marcus asked, his voice unsteady. "He's not on the road anymore," she whispered, her eyes wide. Before Marcus could respond, a sharp knock came from the back window. Both of them screamed, and Marcus nearly swerved off the road. The knock came again, louder this time. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, and his heart stopped. The man was sitting in the back seat, his hat tipped forward, hiding his face. His hands rested on his knees, long fingers twitching slightly. "How did he?" Leah began, but Marcus cut her off. "Don't look at him," he hissed, his voice shaking. "Just don't look." The car sped down the winding road, the engine roaring as Marcus pressed the pedal to the floor. Outside, the world grew darker, the headlights barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead. The radio crackled to life, emitting a low, guttural static that rose and fell like distorted breathing. "Stop the car," a voice whispered, barely audible over the static. Leah whimpered, clutching Marcus's arm. He spoke. "Don't listen to him," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "We're getting out of here." The static grew louder, morphing into a chorus of voices, children laughing, women screaming, men whispering unintelligible words. The temperature in the car plummeted, their breaths fogging the windows. Suddenly, the man leaned forward. His hat slid back, revealing a face that wasn't human. His skin was ashen, his eyes deep black pits, and his mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with rows of sharp, uneven teeth. "Stop," he hissed, his voice reverberating through the car like an earthquake. Marcus slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, and the man was gone. The voices stopped, and the forest was silent once more. Is he gone?" Leah asked, her voice trembling. Marcus nodded, though his hands still shook. "Yeah, he's gone." They didn't speak as they drove the rest of the way to their cabin, refusing to look at the mirrors or windows. When they finally arrived, they bolted inside, locking every door and window. Neither of them slept that night. The next morning, Marcus went outside to check the car. Frost covered the windshield, and written in the frost were 2 words, "See you." The couple packed their belongings and left the mountains that same day. But no matter where they went, Marcus began seeing shadows in his mirrors, fleeting movements in the corners of his eyes. Leah swore she heard footsteps behind her when she walked alone, though no one was ever there. Months later, Marcus's car was found abandoned on the Devil's Vein. The doors were locked, the engine cold, and the interior covered in frost. No one has seen Marcus or Leah since, but travelers on the road claim to see 2 figures standing by the roadside at night, waiting for their next ride.